The first time I stepped into Mr. Harrington's mansion, the silence nearly crushed me. It wasn't the peaceful silence one found in a chapel or a library. No, this was the silence of abandonment. The echo of years spent without laughter, without voices, without warmth. The hallways were lined with priceless paintings, the floors polished to a mirrored shine, but everything felt cold, lifeless. I had been hired as his live-in caretaker, though hired felt like the wrong word. It wasn't a simple job. It was a responsibility, a sentence, and perhaps even a test. Arthur Harrington was one of the wealthiest men in the country, a billionaire whose name commanded boardrooms and headlines. But to me, he wasn't the legend people whispered about. He was just an old man dying alone. When I met him, he was already frail, his skin stretched thin over his bones, his voice little more than a rasp, and yet his eyes steel gray, sharp, unforgiving, still carried the weight of a man who had conquered empires. "Don't pity me," he croaked the first night I fed him soup. "I don't need pity. I'm not here to pity you," I replied gently. "I'm here to take care of you." Something flickered in his gaze then. Suspicion, perhaps, or maybe a small spark of curiosity. Most people, I imagined, had either wanted something from him or feared him. I was neither. I saw not the billionaire, but the man lonely, broken, and nearing his end. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the walls between us crumbled. I learned of his insomnia, the way he often stared out the window at night, as though expecting someone to appear at the gates. I discovered his quiet love for classical music, and how the strains of a violin could soften the hard lines on his face. And perhaps most unexpectedly, he began to talk. Late one evening, as the rain tapped against the windows, he whispered something that stayed with me. "I had a daughter once, but I lost her. Life has a way of stealing what matters most, doesn't it?" His voice cracked on the word daughter, and for a moment I saw the Titan crumble. He didn't tell me the whole story then, only fragments. Her name was Eleanor. She had left when she was young, and he hadn't seen her in decades. I didn't press him for details. I only sat with him, holding his trembling hand, and said softly, "Maybe she'll find her way back." He gave a bitter laugh, hollow and broken. "Or maybe some things are lost forever." From that night on, I felt something shift. He trusted me, not as a nurse or a stranger, but as the only witness to his regrets. And though I never admitted it aloud, I began to care for him, not because of his wealth or his legacy, but because beneath the armor of power and pride, he was just an old man who didn't want to die, forgotten. I had no way of knowing then that his lost daughter would soon become the knife that twisted in my back. The winter came earlier than expected that year, and with it, Mr. Harrington's health faltered. His coughing fits grew violent, rattling through his fragile chest like thunder in a broken sky. The once formidable man who had commanded industries now couldn't lift a spoon without trembling. I became more than his caretaker. I was his shadow. I fed him, turned him in bed, read to him when his failing eyes could no longer trace the lines of a page. I was there for every fever, every restless night, every whispered regret that slipped from his lips in moments of weakness. "You'll stay until the end, won't you?" he asked one night, his voice thin as parchment. "I'll stay." I promised, and I meant it. In those last weeks, the mansion that had once felt like a tomb came alive with the rhythm of our small routine. I would play soft music to lull him to sleep, sometimes catching his faint smile when he recognized an old symphony. On rare days, when he had a flicker of strength, he told me stories of the companies he built, the betrayals he endured, and the regrets that haunted him. But always, inevitably, his words circled back to her. "My daughter," he murmured once, staring at the ceiling. If only I had told her that I loved her in my own way. I wanted to ask why she left, why he never searched harder, but I bit my tongue. Some wounds were too deep for probing. The end came quietly, as most endings do. I was holding his hand when his breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling like a fragile tide. His eyes, cloudy with pain, locked on mine for a moment that stretched into eternity. "Thank you," he whispered. The last words of a man who had billions, but only one person at his side when the darkness came, and then, with a faint exhale, Arthur Harrington was gone. I wept not for his wealth, not for his name, but for the man who had entrusted me with his final moments. I thought foolishly that this bond would mean something, that when his will was read, there would be a small piece of gratitude left for me, a cottage on the estate, perhaps, or even just a token, a letter of acknowledgement. Something to say I saw you, I valued you. Days later, I stood among his lawyers in a mahogany, paneled room, the air heavy with anticipation. My heart pounded as they opened the will, his voice echoing through ink and paper. But when the words were read aloud, I felt the blood drain from my face. Every penny, every property, every fragment of his empire, left not to me, not to charity, not to anyone who had stood by him, but to someone named only as his lost daughter. The room spun. My knees weakened. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it's dealt by the very hands you held at the end. Interested but by the ARTHUR quit, of the IFUHARRINGTON, had bred into the TAKEN his P last breath in my RTNERARMSHASP. And yet, in the cold permanence of his will, I was nothing more than a shadow, forgotten and discarded. The day she arrived, the mansion seemed to breathe again, but not with life. It was the kind of stir caused by disruption, the uneasy shift of servants and lawyers as they scrambled to welcome a stranger who suddenly held the keys to everything. She stepped out of a sleek black car like she'd walked off the pages of a glossy magazine. Tall, elegant, and wrapped in a coat that screamed wealth, she carried herself as though she had always belonged here. The whispers followed her instantly. That's her, the daughter, Arthur's heir, after all these years. But I, who had sat at his bedside, who had listened to the broken fragments of regret spill from his lips, felt something else. An unease, a wrongness. Eleanor Harrington. She introduced herself, her smile polished but hollow. Her eyes swept over me briefly dismissively, as though I were nothing more than the help. Eleanor, the name he had once whispered in the dead of night, his voice cracking with pain. I remembered the sorrow, the bitterness, the realness in the way he had spoken of his daughter. But this woman, she wore his name like a crown, not a scar. She walked the halls with an authority that made my stomach twist. Within hours of her arrival, she was consulting lawyers, nodding over deeds and documents, and speaking of future plans for the estate. It was as though she had been waiting all her life for this moment, but the more I watched, the more I saw the cracks. She didn't know his favorite room in the house. She didn't flinch at the music he used to request every night. She didn't even glance at the faded portrait of a young girl in the study, the real Elena, the one he had lost. Doubt turned to suspicion, and suspicion hardened into certainty. This woman was not who she claimed to be. One evening, after the lawyers had gone, I confronted her gently. "You must have many memories of your father," I said, testing her. "What do you remember most about him?" She hesitated for just a moment too long. Then she gave a rehearsed smile. "His strength, he was a powerful man. It was the answer of a stranger, not a daughter." That night, when the mansion finally grew quiet, I found myself standing in Arthur's study, my fingers tracing the spine of the journals he had kept locked away. I opened one, heart pounding, and discovered pages filled with confessions, regrets, and fragments of his search for his real daughter. The woman in his journals was not the woman now parading as Eleanor. The betrayal I had felt at the will's reading twisted into something darker. Rage, determination. If Arthur Harrington's final mistake was leaving everything to a ghost, then I would correct it. I had cared for him when no one else had. I had held his hand when his empire meant nothing, and I would not let a fraud steal the life he left behind. The war for truth and for my revenge had only just begun. The days that followed were a masquerade. Eleanor, if that was truly her name, sat in leather chairs, signed papers with a steady hand, and gave orders as though the estate were already hers. But beneath her polished veneer, I saw the flicker of nerves. She avoided certain questions, sidestepped personal details, and never once dared to visit Arthur's grave. I began my quiet war. While she reveled in her false inheritance, I combed through the mansion's forgotten corners. In his journals, Arthur had written of blood, a DNA test stored in the safe, to prove her identity should she ever return. My hands trembled when I found the sealed envelope in his study, still intact. Inside was a swab, decades old but preserved, alongside a notarized statement. The truth was within my grasp. I had samples of hers easily enough. A strand of hair from her golden brush, a wine glass she left half finished. I took them to a discreet laboratory, my heart pounding with each passing day. When the results returned, they confirmed what my instincts had screamed from the moment I saw her. No relation, the woman was an imposter, but revenge, I knew, had to be more than proof. It had to be spectacle. The lawyers convened in the grand hall for the official transfer of assets. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her lips curved in a smug smile, while I lingered in the shadows like the servant she believed me to be. When the final papers were about to be signed, I stepped forward, a folder clutched tightly in my hands. "I wouldn't rush if I were you," I said, my voice steady though my heart thundered. Every head turned. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, annoyance flashing across her perfect features. "You don't belong here," she snapped. "Neither do you," I replied, placing the documents on the table. "Because you are not Arthur Harrington's daughter." Gasps rippled through the room as I laid out the evidence: the DNA test, Arthur's journal entries, the notarized statement of his real search for Eleanor. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, until one of the lawyers finally cleared his throat. "This changes everything." Eleanor's mask cracked then. Her composure slipped, panic flooding her features as the lawyers closed the files and security approached. For all her elegance, she left the mansion that day not as an heir, but as a fraud exposed. And me. For the first time, eyes turned to me, not as the nurse, not as the caretaker, but as the one who had been there when no one else had. Arthur Harrington's true legacy was not his fortune, but the loyalty he had once overlooked. Weeks later, the court ruled that the estate would be overseen by trustees, with a significant portion set aside in my name, as recognition of my service and devotion. I didn't walk away with billions, but I walked away with dignity, justice, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had avenged the man I cared for. As I closed the mansion doors behind me, I realized revenge doesn't always mean taking what was stolen. Sometimes it is enough to expose the thief and reclaim your own worth. And that truly was the sweetest revenge.